I hope you're not getting too cold. You're still surviving here. So we have next Jake Valletta from Mandiant, and he's gonna do some awesome, interesting stuff about flash and NAND and hardware stuff. So take it away, Jake.
Awesome. All right, thank you so much. And I'm gonna do my best. I don't want to eat this mic, but I gotta kill it really close here. So I'm not going to say the whole name because it's quite long, but as you just heard, we're going to be talking about some NAND processing techniques, and I'm going to go through a couple different steps here for us. So just real quick about who I am. I work at Mandiant, which was in FireEye, now it's Google, but it's still Mandiant in my heart. I've been around for about 11 years, so I joined back in 2011, and I did mostly incident response and forensics my early career, and then later in life I do more embedded work, actually more of like a manager, so I don't put that on here, but my kind of passion area is embedded security and vulnerability research. So I'm based in San Francisco, so the weather's a little bit different, and this is definitely the best view I've had at a BSides or any conference. Usually it's in some stuffy hotel room, so this is quite nice. Okay, so I'm going to do some quick overview, talk about different types of chips. I'm actually kind of happy that you guys have a badge because I can use this as a prop here. And then we're going to talk about PCB inspection, some chip removal, talk about how to get data off chips. And then we're going to go in kind of the meat of it, the parsing and mounting techniques. And then the last piece, the example next steps, is kind of like what do you do from here? We could have a whole conversation about that particular phase, so we're not going to be finding bugs or demoing exploits or something like that. So the purpose of the presentation is to kind of help enable this sort of mission statement we have here. So let's just say you go on Amazon, you want to find some IoT device, and your goal is to find bugs in it. Obviously step one is to buy the device, get it, probably take it apart, plug it in, set it up. There's a number of obstacles that you may encounter while you're doing this, right? So even before you buy something, you can look up on like the FCC docs to see if there's any images out there. You could look for prior research. Once you have the device, you're going to want to do a couple things. So one, you're probably going to want to try to obtain the firmware images. So you could Google around, go on some forums. Maybe you can find a firmware update page for the manufacturer's website. It's going to be really helpful to have a firmware image. I would say just in terms of methodology, you want to kind of shift it from like a black box approach to gray or white. So any kind of information you can find out about this device is really going to help you be successful in finding bugs. But what if you can't find the firmware image, right? It's not the end of the world, but it does make things a little more challenging if you don't have access to that. Let's just say it's a camera or some sort of IoT device for your home. You plug it in, you get it on the network, you run Nmap on it, and there's no ports, right? So now you have limited attack surface on the network side. Not really much you can look at there. Or maybe there's a web server running and it's got credentials that you don't know, so you can't log in. And then finally, let's say maybe you take this thing apart and just like this guy here, you look at it, it's pretty clear there might be some UART on there. Maybe your device doesn't have UART or doesn't have JTAG. So if these kind of scenarios all play out, you don't really have a lot to go on, right? So the solution, what we're going to talk about here is if your device is using external flash, so like a storage medium, can we get data off the flash and use that to aid our research, right? So I just listed a couple examples there, but there's a lot of use cases here, right? You could be, again, looking for passwords for that web server. Obviously the firmware image has binaries on it, or maybe keys to SSH or something, but we'll go through a bunch of examples when I get further. Just a couple of things that we're not really going to talk about, so this isn't going to be about like reverse engineering. I don't think I have any IDA screenshots, sorry. We're not going to go too much into binary analysis, just a little bit, kind of set the stage. We're not going to talk about UART or JTAG, like how at a protocol level. We'll talk a little bit about SPI. And I'm not going to go into any sort of power analysis or that kind of stuff. So we're going to keep it kind of high level, and I'm going to try to keep everyone awake, so if I see people nodding off, I'll click through some of the more boring slides. Okay, so first, just a few slides of theory, then I'll move on to the fun stuff, promise. Non-volatile storage, right? So in an embedded device, you're going to have to store data somewhere. This is contrasted to something like RAM. So right, RAM is going to be like your memory where things loaded, and when you turn it off, you lose all that data. There's two main locations or kind of ways you're going to see this on a device. One is going to be included inside of a chip. So for example, the badge here, this is an ESP32, right? So this has flash inside of it, and from like a physical perspective, to get access to that would probably mean taking off this heat shield, maybe decapping whatever chip is in there. It's going to be kind of hard, not really my first tack that I would do here. And then the other area is going to be on like another chip elsewhere on the board. So I didn't see any on this guy. So if it did have one, that would have been really cool, because then we could have used that as an example. But those are kind of the two main areas you're going to focus on. If it's included in the SOC, I wouldn't spend, SOC system on chip. If it is included in there, I don't think I would start off with that. I would definitely start with the external, or maybe some of those other avenues that I mentioned, like the network side. We're looking for UART or JTAG, just because it can be way more complicated to get stuff off of an SoC. Two kind of main access mediums here, parallel versus serial. I'm going to talk more about that in a few other slides, so I'm not going to go too much into that here. And then kind of just setting the stage in terms of types. So almost anything you'll see now is flash-based. I'm not an electrical engineer, so I'm not going to talk about like how that actually works at a like fundamental level. But a lot of things are flash. And then kind of another category, which some of these are actually considered flash now. So like ROM and EEPROM, those are usually much smaller for things like bootloaders and more like low-level devices. But we're going to focus on flash memory here. And then when you divide flash down one level, you end up with usually NAND versus NOR. So just to contrast them a little bit, NOR flash is usually a little smaller chip. These are usually serial bus. So for example, like these 8-pin chips on here, these would be like a serial interface using SPI. NOR is a lot faster for reading and a lot slower for writing, right? So usually when you have an embedded device and there is like a bootloader stored on a chip, or maybe some really low-level configuration data that doesn't change, that may be stored on a NOR flash, and maybe the people who built the device won't have a mechanism to update that. It just kind of stays the way it is. There's also an assumption that the data is valid in the NOR world. So I'll talk about that a lot in a couple of slides later here, but there's no bad blocks in the NOR world. Now on the NAND side, these are generally much larger, especially more recent devices. You can have multiple gigs on flash memory now. And this is going to be where you're going to find things like kernels, file systems. You'll also see bootloaders here, so it's not impossible that it would be there. User data, of course, configuration, logging, all that stuff. That's going to be usually on a NAND flash. Two kind of main mechanisms for access here. You'll see parallel. So parallel just uses more pins. I have some pictures you'll see. Or a serial protocol for MMC or SPI. The big piece here is the bad blocks can be found on the device from the factory, right? So if you buy a chip, let's say you buy like a sheet of a bunch of NAND flashes, it's entirely possible there's actually bad blocks on there right from the factory, and you have to, you being either yourself or a chip company who uses this, has to kind of account for that. And that'll play into how we actually gain access to this. Just one last thing, reading is a little slower here, but writing is much faster than NOR. And that's why you'll see this used for file systems and firmware. Okay, so two types of NAND, because we're going to focus kind of just on NAND for the rest of this talk. One is referred to as raw NAND, so this is going to be kind of the lowest cost per bit. You can think of this kind of as like a bucket, right? It's just like a bucket, and there's bits inside of that, and somebody else, and I'm just calling it external management here, has to actually manage this flash for you in the form of like a controller, right? So this picture here on the left has two chips. This is just off Wikipedia. So this is a parallel NAND right here, and parallel, see all these pins on each side. This is actually a 48-pin flash. That's just those bits. That's the bucket. And then over here on the right, this guy, that's going to be the NAND controller, right? So the data's all here. It's kind of unstructured in the sense that whoever's reading this, whether it's an operating system or a microcontroller, it's kind of interfacing through this little controller guy here, and it's pretty transparent to him where those bad blocks are, or if the data's some blocks are older than others. That's called wear leveling. And that's all transparent to the operating system. And we're going to be talking about RAW. That's going to be kind of my main focus for this presentation. Generally speaking, it's going to be using the ONFI layer, which is just a protocol used to read and write from NAND. Managed NAND, on the other hand, is actually quite popular, right? So you'll see this a lot. And the reason I'm not talking about it is because I think it's a lot easier to deal with. There's not as many gotchas or nuances here. Because you're basically using the controller, because it's inside of the chip here, right? So this picture over here, we have the external controller hanging out. This one, it's on the die, right? So this is a, forget how many pins, 158 pin maybe, 58 pin BGA chip. This is a flash right here, and the controller is part of this. And you can go on Amazon and buy one of these all sockets here. Oh, sorry, 153. This is an eMMC chip, so the controller's in there. All you have to do, get it off the board, plug it into the right socket here. You can't see it on the other side, but there's an like an SD card configuration there, and you just plug that into your laptop. Right? It's going to mount that as an SD card, and your data is going to be there, and it's super easy. If there's any like encryption going on, you'll have to kind of solve that separately. But the idea is, if you have MMC, your biggest challenge is going to be getting the data off and then reading it. These eMMC, which is what this is extremely popular in mobile devices and devices that use SoCs. So I see it a lot on like children's toys, definitely cell phones, conference room phones, that kind of stuff. A lot of the newer devices, so think like flagship Samsungs, I think even Apple, they now use this universal flash storage. It's just another managed NAND, really, and the readers are starting to become available. They're definitely more expensive than the eMMC readers. This one's probably like $100 on Amazon, and most of them that I've dealt with are this 153 or 169 format. Oh yeah, so it does all the management of the bad blocks, of the wear leveling. That's all handled inside of the chip, and that's why it's easier for you, because you don't have to deal with any of that. It's not written on here, but one last thing I wanted to mention, data sheets, right? So if let's say you're building something, let's say you're building this badge, and you want to use a raw NAND, you're definitely going to need the data sheet, right? So those are all publicly available. Like, you will need access to that to actually do what you need to do. On the right over here, it is written, but you don't usually get the data sheet here. All you're going to get is the pinout, so what the pins actually do, and that's kind of all you need, right? You won't really need a lot of details about this chip to do things, but for raw NAND, you're going to need to know like the device ID, some different parameters, which we'll get into in a few slides, but the data sheet's going to be critical. Okay, no more theory, we can actually do some more fun stuff. So now we know we're focusing on raw NAND. The next step is to identify the NAND on your device and then get it off the device. So what I always recommend doing is, if you buy a device or you have a badge or something right here, you're going to want to start off by making an inventory of everything on the PCB, right? So I checked in this morning and I was looking at this. I noticed this 8-pin chip over here. That's I think it's a CH330. That's the USB to UART chip, which is conveniently located right next to the USB, and then the pins go to the UART, so that was pretty easy to identify. The IC, as I mentioned, the main controller was an ESP32, right? So that's going to be your main processor here, microcontroller. And again, I didn't notice any flash hanging out on this guy, but if you did have that, I would find that, and then pull down the relevant docs for these things. So grab the data sheets for each of them, any sort of pinouts you can find, and try to understand the purpose of each of these chips. You don't need to worry about like transistors or resistors, diodes, at least not for your initial analysis. Just focus on like what these things are doing functionally, and then go from there. So obviously, as part of this, you're going to find the flash. The common package types you'll see, it's actually better that this device actually has the SOIC 8 on it. This is a 16 format. This is really popular for flash, usually in the 8-pin arrangement though. The one on the right there, the TOSP, or TSOP as I call it, is the 48-pin parallel flash. This is also a very popular format that you'll see in a lot of IoT devices. You'll also see the top two listed here, the ones I just mentioned, SOIC and TSOP. Those are both with the pins exposed, right? So those are my preferred ones I find. The bottom two, BGA and flat no lead, the pins are usually going to be really small on the sides or all on the bottom, right? And that's just going to really change how you get these chips off the device. It's still possible for both of them, but it's definitely a little bit more complicated. So taking it off. Now this can seem, if you've never done this before, it can seem a little scary. It was definitely scary for me. I was so terrified that I was going to actually cause damage. And over time, you realize that these chips are pretty resilient, even though the data sheets say like, oh, don't get it too hot. They can get pretty hot and things will still work. For long-term use, I'm not sure, but at least for our purposes of taking it off, doing a reading of it, and then probably throwing it in the trash, these methods should work. So you really have three main ways you could do this. Now the first one is to use a soldering station. that's going to be when you have these, right? So you can definitely take chips off with just solder. You don't need to use hot air. What you can do is, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but if you watch a couple YouTube videos, it'll make sense. You can use this idea called raking. So basically just put a big old blob of solder right here, and then kind of like rake it across the pins. And if you put enough on there, it becomes like this whole pool of solder. And if you make that whole thing molten, you can use tweezers and kind of lift the chip up a little bit, and then let it solidify, do the other side, and then kind of just like slowly lift the chip off the board. You got to be careful you don't bend anything, but it can be done, and I've done that for these ones here because it's easy to just put a bunch of solder on here and just kind of lift it up slowly. You could also use hot air. That's what this picture is on the left here. So there's kind of three things going on in this picture. You got the soldering iron off to the left. In the middle is a PCB heater with a PCB in it, and then a kind of a hot air gun over the top of it. This is obviously the stage photo. You wouldn't want to be that far away, but that's kind of your arrangement there. And then on the right is just the hot air gun set to about 300 C. But the idea is this thing right here is warming up the board for you. So you set that to, I think it's pretty low in this picture, again, stage photo, but it's at 160 C here. So what you're doing is kind of just pumping heat into the PCB so that you're warming the whole board consistently. And the reason for this is some PCBs will have like a lot of copper on them, or they're really big PCBs. And the second you start putting heat onto a chip, all that heat can start going to other parts of the board, and then you'll end up just sitting there forever trying to warm it up while the heat dissipates. So the idea is, what if you warm everything up, then it doesn't have to disperse much, and then it's a lot easier for you to actually get the chip off. And basically you can just kind of sit there and warm up a specific spot, and then the solder will become molten, and you can kind of lift the chip off and let it cool down. Your mileage will vary depending on if it's leaded solder versus unleaded. Obviously it melts at a different temperature, so you'll have to kind of factor that in when you're actually trying to do this. Just this picture on the right here, this kind of gross looking, it's kind of hard to see, but it's like gross yellow stuff. This is just a high heat tape that I like to use to cover up everything else that's not what I want to take off, because I don't want little resistors to go flying, or maybe just make things molten nearby. But you basically would just end up with this, right? You have, this is where the chip was, this is where it is now. See the solder is kind of still hanging out on this chip here. You're going to have to clean that off. The last thing, and you could have like a whole slide deck on just desoldering and how all this stuff works. I just want to kind of show you at a high level how you could do this. The last method, which is actually pretty cool, does anyone use infrared to take off chips? It's pretty cool. You can find cheap ones on like eBay and AliExpress, but essentially you're using IR to kind of focus it on the chip, and it looks like just a light turning on and off, and then all of a sudden the solder is molten and there's maybe some smoke. It's pretty cool. The cheap ones are probably not recommended because you're doing some high voltage, or I guess it's like dangerous things with a thing you bought on eBay. The more expensive ones are very, very much more expensive and more commercial, but it does work, and I've used those and it's been pretty fun. Once you get the chip off, you can, well, one, clean it and then focus on reading the data. So cleaning it's actually really important, not the most exciting part, but once you have the chip off, right, so this one here, you can see, some of these pins are already touching and there's a lot of solder on here. You're gonna have to get rid of that. So the solution usually is to just use some flux. That's what this picture is here. This stuff's really good. I think it's Amtech. You can buy it on Amazon there. It's really good. I'd recommend that if you're gonna do any sort of either BGA or kind of just like flash removal stuff here. It's probably like $40 for that tube. But you need to get all the solder off the pins, and the chip should sit like pretty much completely flat, right? So if you set it down and kind of like touch it and it wobbles, that means there's still going to be a little bit of solder on there. You can use some solder wick, which is kind of like a copper wire that you can heat up with some flux on it, and it'll pull the solder off the IC. But it should sit completely flat, and you should be able to visually inspect it and say, yeah, there's no more solder on this. Next, you're going to want to remove all the residue that you left on there. Has anyone ever done this, by the way? Like taking this off? The next thing you're going to have to do is get all that flux off of there, which is like really sticky and kind of like discolored. So you could use acetone or isopropyl alcohol to just kind of clean out. I use a toothbrush, so I'll just like set the chip down and kind of just scrub it a little bit, and then it removes all this really sticky stuff down here. This stuff's like extremely sticky. You definitely use gloves. Once it's clean, you're going to want to read the data off of it. So a few different options you could do here. I'm really going to talk about this one. This is probably the easiest one. Option one, there are like kind of feature built chips that you can use to kind of make your own breakout board. This is going to be the one that gives you the most versatility. and I guess control over things. I've never done this. I have one of these, but I've never actually set it up because it seemed like a kind of a weekend project. But it's really just a chip that allows you to kind of write your own reader for parallel flash. There's blogs on it if you look it up. It's pretty, not too complicated, but it's not the easiest. Option 2, which is definitely the easiest, is go on eBay, just look up one of these two products here, and these things are about $100. They come with like every socket adapter you can imagine, all sorts of peripherals and cables. Of course, comes with some nice software that conveniently doesn't want to run in VMs and has lots of WeChat links, but it does work, and it will support a lot of different chips for you. So I would recommend, these are the two that I use. I use them both because I've had issues where maybe one device doesn't have support for a chip, the other one does, or they both claim they have support, but I read it with one of them and the results are crazy. So kind of having that redundancy works really well. Like I said, they're both about $100 or less. And then the last one is flash ROM. Personally, I use this more for SPI chips, so when they're the 8-pin ones. And it's kind of similar to the first option here, but it is a way, and it's also open source, right? So you can use that, you can write your own profiles for chips. Again, a little bit more legwork if you have to write your own profile. We could have a whole slide deck on just doing that, so just throwing that out there as an option if you wanted to. But for option 2 here, look how easy this is. You put your chip in there that's nice and clean, and then you close it, and then you load up that software I talked about, and then what gets spit out is basically just a binary dump of the flash, right? Because these readers come from China, I'd recommend creating probably 2 or 3 of them, and then MD5ing them. Just make sure that you're seeing consistency in the data. Sometimes I've had a couple bits be wrong here and there, and that'll really make things more challenging down the road when you're trying to like decrypt files and it's failing. And you're like, I know this is right, I know it's the password, why isn't it working? And it turns out one byte earlier on was corrupted. So definitely take a couple flash dumps, and then at this point, you're kind of done in the hardware world, right? You don't really need any more soldering irons or hot air or sockets. You can kind of push all that stuff away and shift your analysis to a software world. One little thing that's kind of fun is, and this if you're thinking about like how you can use this and how you can be successful in whatever project you're doing, it is possible to put the chips back on, right? So imagine a scenario where you plug in a device, it's got UART, you connect over UART, and UART's just a serial connection, right? You connect in and you turn it on and it says, hey, welcome to Linux, enter the password, and let's say you don't know the password. Well, you could take the chip off and then find that password in Etsy password, or Etsy Shadow, wherever they put it, and then change it, resolder it, and then boot it up again, and then you would know the password and you could log in. So you could make changes and get this thing to boot back up. I will say there's a number of things you have to consider, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, but it is something that can be done, and I've done that in the past. It's not a great photo, but you can see that it's soldered back on there, and I'm pretty proud of that solder job. It's much easier when you can see the pins, of course, right? So if you are resoldering something that is BGA, what I'm calling non-visible, it's a lot more challenging. You have to buy these crazy BGA stencils off of eBay, and then use some solder paste and reball it, and then hope it all works. This right here is actually kind of a fun example. This is a little USB device. It's a, I think BGA like 176 layout. But I did take this, desolder it, clean it, use the stencil in the middle here, reballed it with this stuff here that I bought. This is MG Chemical, I think is the brand. This stuff's also great, get on Amazon. Reballed it here, put it back on there, and then it did work. So I was very shocked actually that it did work, but it is possible. You can use hot air and just kind of line it up, and it will kind of reseat as you solder it back on. I wouldn't recommend this as like your first thing. This is like you've tried a lot of other things and they're not working. This is like your last line of defense. Even this one, I wouldn't recommend doing until you've really exhausted a lot of other options. There are probably better mediums out there, but just something to think about when you start kind of coming up with an attack plan here. Okay, next we have the read. Now we're going to focus on actually understanding how this data is arranged. And because we're dealing with raw NAND, we have to assume that there was some kind of controller level in the middle, and we're going to basically have to unpack that to make sure that we're looking at the data correctly. All right, so if you go online and type in embedded embedded research blog or something, or hacking a router or something, you're going to get to some guy's blog and it's going to be very informative, but they're always going to run binwalk and be like, I ran binwalk, all the data was there, I found the password, and that's awesome, but it's not going to work every step of the way. And this is how I usually get involved with projects where I work, is somebody will say, hey, I'm trying to work on this embedded device, I ran binwalk, it didn't work. And then they send me something like this, and then we have to kind of talk through like some of these concepts that we're going to go over and why you're seeing this. So it's not always going to work. In this example here, this is some work that we did that we published on the Mandiant blog a couple years ago. If you run binwalk on it, it's good data, right? You see that there's a U-boot header up here, some compressed data, which is probably the kernel, or maybe it's part of the bootloader. And then you see all these file systems here, and that's unusual, right? You would never see that many file systems in an embedded device. And your other kind of indicator that something's wrong here are these offsets, right? So these are kind of wild offsets. And it'd be very, very unlikely that a file system is going to be at a random hexadecimal offset that doesn't align to a block, right? We'll talk about blocks in a second here. So anyway, something's wrong here. So when you're dealing with NAND, you have two like kind of units of measurement, I guess, or storage. So a page is going to be the smallest thing that you can write, and a block is the smallest thing that you erase. So when you do a bulk erase of a NAND, you do that in a block, and you write things at like a driver level in the page. And all this data is going to be in the data sheet, right? So it's going to say the page is 2048 bytes, and the block is 64 pages, right? And those, you'll need to know that data when you're dealing with this. Now, one kind of nuance here to deal with is this concept of main versus spare data, right? So we're going to talk about that in the next slide here, but you have to remember there's two of those. And I just mentioned this on the last slide, but file systems, partitions, whatever, are almost always going to be on the block boundary, right? Because if you are doing like a NAND wipe, you want to make sure you can actually wipe blocks, so you're not going to have a kernel taking up a block and a half, right? It's going to be 1 block, 3 blocks, 4 blocks, whatever. So the spare area is actually really important, and this is oftentimes the first thing wrong when somebody runs binwalk, is they didn't account for this. So I mentioned earlier in the slides that there's this out-of-band data, or I'm sorry, that there was a bad block data, and that's usually what you find and what the purpose of this out-of-band area is. This is where you're going to store other things about the page that are to make sure the data can be trusted, right? And I'm going to go over that in a second here, but the arrangement is usually recommended by the chip company. So this is, I think, a Micron one I found. They recommend, well, they're going to tell you, one, you have 2048 bytes of main data and 64 of spare. Okay, they're recommending having main, and then the 4 spares here at the end. That's not always the case, right? It's really going to depend on whatever's controlling this NAND, how they store things. So you may have, you know, main, spare, and hopefully once you start looking at the binary, you can tell the difference. But you're going to have to make sure you understand that, because binwalk has no idea about any of this stuff. It's just reading the data, and you'll have to kind of look at the binary and see what happens. And the main thing, mostly for us, since we're just trying to read data, we just want to get rid of this, right? We don't really want any out-of-band data. A couple of caveats here in a minute, but most of the time we just want to get rid of it. All right, so the first use of the spare area is bad blocks, right? So it's going to depend on, again, the controller or the chip, but usually there's this little marker, 2-byte marker, on the first page of a block that will indicate that it's good. If you find a block that doesn't have that, then that's probably considered a bad block. And again, you have to pull up the data sheet for your chip to confirm. ECC is a checksum that's pretty cool, because not only does it tell you if something's wrong, but it has data within itself to self-correct things, which is pretty cool. So you'll be able to identify a problem and potentially correct up to n bits of data, which can help you if there was a read error. But this is going to be usually per page or per subpage, right? So this is going to be basically a checksum of all the page data, right? So back to this slide, right? You have data, and then usually you'll have like checksum, and whatever NAND driver is reading this is going to basically check, are these ECCs correct? What else? This one's really important if you are making changes, right? This is probably the most important thing. If you plan on doing what I described earlier, taking chips off, putting them back on, you have to recalculate the ECC, right? Because otherwise it's going to turn on, start checking those ECCs, and they're going to be wrong, and it's going to think it's all bad data and mark the whole board bad blocks. Calculating ECC depends entirely on which algorithm is being used, if it's open source versus closed. The Linux kernel has its own drivers that use BSiDES, so if it is a Linux-based system, then it's probably pretty easy. I've looked at devices, particularly with like Broadcom chips. They use a lot of closed source software. They have their own ECC algorithms, so I don't know how to calculate those. And then finally, there are use cases where file systems, excuse me, at a higher level are storing data in the out-of-band area. So the two main culprits here are GIFs, which we'll talk about. For us, we don't really care about this, so it doesn't matter. YAFs, which is an older file system, but I just did an assessment last year where there was GIF or YAFs, which seemed odd. I haven't seen this in probably 7 or 8 years. But there are structural data inside out of band, which are important when you're actually trying to mount these file systems. Okay. What I wanted to show on this slide is, this is just some this is a random chip I was looking at here. And this is going to be why binwalk is largely failing for you. So let's say I think this is part of the bootloader, right? You're looking at the bootloader, you see all these strings here. It's obviously binary because there's 0 zeros here. But then all of a sudden you'll see this kind of section down here where all of a sudden it's just Fs, right? And then immediately after we see strings again. This is probably your out-of-band data, right? And if you look, I made sure that I aligned it nice, so there should be 64 bytes here, which is pretty common, right? This is the data that you got to get out of there, right? Because when you try to bin walk this, it's just going to include this, and if it's like a zip file or a binary or something, that stuff's got to go. A couple other techniques you can use here. I like if there is a page that's all zeroed or all F'd, and then all of a sudden you see really high entropy data, and that high entropy data repeats itself, that usually means that there's 4 ECC hashes back to back, all hashing the same thing, right? So if you can find an all zeroed or all F page, then that can help you confirm that it is ECC, because it'll be the same, because it's a hash, right? It's going to always be the same. It's not encryption. And you'll notice these patterns as you play around with them. We're not going to go through every line here, but just something. This is really easy to do. Basically, read in your file, set the out-of-band size, and set your page size. And then all I do is I just read main and then out-of-band to do 2 different files, and I just do that for the whole chip, right? And then you end up with 2 files, one called .main, one .out-of-band, and that file you can probably pass to binwalk, and it's going to be okay. And of course, you'll have to tweak this kind of right section here, depending on how that layout looks, right? So that's kind of an exercise for whoever's using this to do, but it's not challenging to just remove that out of there. The last thing we have to do before we start mounting things is to determine the partitions and how the flash is arranged. And this is, again, you could spend a lot of time just talking about this. I'm just going to give you guys 2 techniques that'll work pretty well here. One, if you're dealing with a device that's using the U-boot bootloader, so you guys, maybe if anyone's seen that in your travels, U-boot, it's pretty common. It's a pretty small, easy to embed bootloader. And one of the things that it does is it'll include the layout of the flash as an invariant variable, or a config variable, I guess, that gets passed to the kernel, right? Because your kernel or your microprocessor or whatever has no idea what this NAND looks like, right? So it's just going to assume that there's some data here, and it needs to be told what that looks like. The MDT parts variable is really useful, right? And you can kind of see it full skewed over here, but basically it's going to be the size of a partition and then the name of that, right? So this one here has got like FBI, which is probably like first bootloader, SBI, which makes secondary bootloader, and then you can see down here we'll have like configuration, root file system, right? But you can use this along with your knowledge of how the out-of-band data is structured to basically split this firmware dump into a bunch of small partition dumps that you can actually play with individually. Now, you don't have to do this, right? You could use binwalk, and if that works, great. But I like to do this and have it all be divided out so that I can see exactly what each one of these files is. That's kind of the easy example. Sometimes you'll see this, where you're scrolling through and all of a sudden you see this kind of just blob of binary data here. It's the same thing, right? So it's the same data, the name of the file, the name of the partition with the size, but this time it's just in a binary structure, right? So this will take a little bit of analysis to figure out, like, at byte 1, is that the size or is it the end data? But you could write a little parser here. That's really hard to see, sorry. This is the Solar City device that we looked at, that we put on our blog. It's just a binary format. Write a little Python script that just kind of chews through it, prints out the partition sizes. But this will take you a little bit of time to understand what it looks like. Maybe some REing of the bootloader. Okay, and I just alluded to this, right? Now we know both those two things. You can actually try to mount these file systems and actually have some fun. So let's talk about that. All right, so I'm going to cover each of these, some in a little bit more detail because some are more popular and some are easier. So these are the ones that I've experienced and that I see. I would say if it's an SoC device, it's probably going to be EXT or maybe UBI or GIFs. YAFs I haven't seen in a long time, except that one device last year. SCHS I've seen, and I've seen this used when combined with like a secure boot or a disk encryption method. That was the only one I listed on here is read-only, because SCHS is usually mounted read-only, and you usually don't change that. It's more like it's basically like an archive, like it's mounted as a file system. And let's see. Before I go through each of these slides, I just want to give you kind of how my brain works. Whatever project I'm working on, I'll use basically a makefile with like a pretty defined directory structure, and that helps me remember what I was doing. So if I have a kind of a task in my head called, mount UBIFS, I'll usually wrap it in a script, and then I'll have that get called here. And you can kind of chain these together. So you say like, mount, just carve, whatever, and then put that like in a README so you don't forget. I always forget this stuff, and then I'm like digging through my bash history. But I like to name things very detailed, so I'll have UBIFS _ raw.bin.main. So it's clear to me that I'm working on just the main data versus out of band. I'm not saying you guys have to do this, but I do find it to be useful. Starting with the easy ones, right? So these are binwalk. We'll have no problem with these, by the way. These are super easy, and even for you guys, it's really easy to do. Just basically make a directory and then use mount, right? So nothing crazy here. Mount will handle all the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff for you. You can use file or binwalk to basically find these. It'll say, hey, SCHS or EXT. Out-of-band data is obviously not important here, so you don't need that in any capacity. But these are really easy, right? I would definitely recommend just mounting them. Things get a little more complicated when we deal with GIFs and UBI, and you'll have to use. Has anyone ever used NANSIM? Has anyone ever gone through this kind of chaotic journey here? So NANSIM is a Linux driver that will simulate a raw NAND in your device. And that's really helpful because if we know the device that we're dealing with, we can tell Linux and have it simulate one for us, and then all the sections will be the right size. And then what we can do is essentially copy over the data we just dumped and then mount it that way. I just described it in like 2 sentences. It's probably a lot more complicated, and when you guys start digging in here, you'll probably have to read some stuff from this guy's website. He's got a very dry humor and has strong opinions about driver technology, but if you guys enjoy that. Really what you'll need here is that 4-byte chip ID that you can get when you're actually reading the chip. So when you're actually dumping it using one of those Chinese readers, they'll give you the 4-byte chip identifier, and we'll use that in a couple slides coming up here. I'm not going to go through all these because I could probably talk about MDT drivers for a while, and you guys don't want to hear about that. But the main things are this lower level MDT one is kind of they call it the flash translation layer or transition layer. And that's going to be representing both the main and the spare, right? So it's going to have both the sections per how that chip thinks it should look. On top of that, it's kind of like a pseudo block driver where it's going to be just the main data, right? So this is going to be at one higher level up. That's usually where you'll hang out unless you have to manipulate the out of band. Or let's say you want to basically mount a UBIFS and then create a copy of that and then flash that to your chip. That one's going to be where you'll use that one, the actual MDT layer. Okay, I'm going to go quick because I have 5 minutes left here. This is what the data sheet will look like. You'll get that 4-byte identifier from it here, and it's going to be all defined for you, 1, F1, 00, 1D. you'll basically plug that into NAND sim here, right? So the same bytes I added here. This is for GIFs. This one you can basically create a NAND simulation and then use DD to just copy it to the block driver, right? So the higher level one. And then you can mount it using mount down here. So that one's actually pretty straightforward. UBIFS, in the interest of time, I'm not going to bore you guys with how the kind of intermediary layers work, but it's pretty similar. In this case, you'll just use whatever the correct bytes are here. And then you can, if you want to, you can basically zero it all out. And you can use a combination of UBI format and attach with all their crazy arguments to actually attach and mount a UBI file system. So these slides will be available after the presentation, so you guys can probably just copy this stuff out. But the nitty-gritties aren't super important. You'll have to kind of figure out what these offsets mean here, because they'll be tied to your specific chip. But again, you're ultimately using mount at the end of the day. YAFs I would love to talk in a lot of detail about, because I really don't like YAFs. But there's basically like one person out there who knows how this works, and he hasn't touched this project in 20 years. So there's a project that's called YAFs 2 utils that's archived on Google Code that you can use to try to unpack things. I've had a lot of mixed experience with it, and if the out-of-band data is not exactly how that tool wants it to be, then it just doesn't work. So you have to like move the data back to where it should be, but that means you have to know what the driver wants and what his tool wants, and it's not fun. Anyway, you can do the same thing here though. These are the parameters here you have to kind of tweak. And I think I have just enough time to kind of leave you with the now what, right? So we just spent 45 minutes talking about how to get access to a device, and I'm kind of leaving you with like, now you have to draw the rest of the owl here. Because once you have access to it, the next step is to kind of go back to that mission statement and find bugs. And there's, again, a lot of things you could do here. We've edited files and resoldered. We've removed different encryption things that were complicating things. We've pulled source code off and used that to find bugs. There's a lot of different things you could do here. But that's a totally different talk, right? Like that's a bug hunting or a binary analysis presentation. But now that you have the data, you kind of can do whatever you want, right? So I'll leave this here just for a second because there's a couple cool things you can do. But then I'll roll into conclusions. Okay, so just to kind of summarize what I talked about and how I would approach this. 1, identify external NAND by inspecting the PCB. 2, remove the chips using solder, hot air, IR, whatever. 3, use a universal reader to get the data off the chip. 4, identify the layout and the partitions by analyzing the binary. 5, mount the relevant file systems. Do what we just talked about, find something cool, make some change, do something, and then optionally put it back on, right? So that process is going to be essentially repeated each time you do this, and each one of these will kind of pose its own unique challenges once you get into it. And with that, I think I have like 1 or 2 minutes left here. There's some material here. I did just pick Mania blogs, but there's plenty of blogs out there. The reason I picked the Mania ones because mostly they're mine, and I can talk about them if you guys want to like learn more about the research. There's plenty of research out there in the space. I think people this isn't like new material, right? Like it's just flash memory at the end of the day, but I want to kind of get it all in one place for people to chew through. If you guys want to contact me, I don't use Twitter very often, but I'm much more active on email. Both my work and personal emails are there, my GitHub is there, and my website. So with that, I don't know if I have any time for questions, but you guys tell me.
We have a couple minutes for questions,
okay.
So do you have any questions for Jay?
Can you go down the backdoors
Yeah. I would say not through this mean, but I've definitely done, and the definition of backdoor is always like, is it an admin util? Is it a purpose-built backdoor? I've definitely found some sketchy binaries running that, expected specific flags to then do things like run commands. So is that a backdoor? Well, sure, but is it also like maybe something that the developers left on there for use testing? I don't know, depends. But yeah, definitely there's some weird things that you'll find when you dive into this world.
I have a question actually. Is there anything standardizable, automatable in what you're doing? It seems everything is custom, like the reading is different, the mounting is different. Is there any patterns that you can say?
I mean,
Is it all different?
there are like kind of a bunch of diverging paths, right? Like if this type of thing, do these 4 things. There are things like bin walk though, like the tool itself is quite good, right? Hopefully no one leaves here and is like, Jake doesn't like bin walk. It's a great tool. It does a lot of the stuff for you. But when it doesn't work, you got to take a step back and understand like kind of the differences. There are also commercial solutions that exist that you could buy that they expect a firmware dump, and then you get like a Nessus report essentially. But that's for like if you're doing this professionally or kind of want to automate things. So this has been automated in some capacities, but it will be a little bit different per chip and device. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much.
Cool.